I want to talk to you guys today about is Germany's post-Holocaust reparation programs, or more specifically payment program, and that distinction is going to turn out to be important to Jews and the state of Israel after World War II, and to see if there are some conceptual, some political, some historical lessons that we can draw from that on the emerging or re-emerging conversation about reparations here. I think there'll also be some connections with some of the discussions you've had about legal hermeneutics and interpretation, specifically echoes of Dworkin, maybe even some echoes of questions about religious traditions of interpretation. So without further ado, let's begin. As I said, I think that this distinction between payment and reparation and broader questions of transitional justice is going to be important. The deal that Germany and Israel struck in the early 1950s was for payment. The Germans liked to call it reparations because of the moral weight that's attached to that word. In Israel, it was insisted that it would be called payouts. The Semitic root, the Hebrew root is shalem, which is the root for paying out money, and also the root, interestingly, for whole. But part of the idea was that all this is payment, and the language of reparations, at least initially, was rejected. But let's see a little bit more specifically how that worked. So by way of background, as is known, I'm assuming, to all of you, in the course of World War II, the Nazis and their collaborators murdered 6 million Jews between 1939 and 1945, largely in the second half of the war. In 1948, the State of Israel was established, and part of the moral and political argument that was offered for the justification was, and in many ways still is, the Holocaust, and the fact that there was a need for a safe haven for the Jews to prevent that from happening again. Germany, of course, was divided between the different powers, most prominently between the Soviets and the Americans. And West Germany entered in the early 1950s into a series of negotiations that were first direct and then, that were first indirect and then direct with the State of Israel over Holocaust reparations or payouts. And these proceeded for a while in secret, and then they went in the open. The negotiations themselves and the resulting compensation agreement, compensation for the harm the Germans had done to Jews during the war, were deeply controversial in Israel, and they pitted questions of national honor and the desire for retribution, which were very prevalent in early Israel, against the basic reality that this was a new state that needed money and that needed resources. The two photos you see here are interesting. On the, as you look at it on the left, the black and white photo is from Luxembourg in 1952 and is a photograph of the ceremony that signs the payment agreement. And on the right is from 2012, which is a photograph of a smaller scale ceremony in Germany for the recurring renegotiation of criteria for negotiations. And I put these side by side to show that this has been going on for a very long time. So this is going on since 1952, essentially till now, and will go on at the very least while there are surviving Holocaust survivors, and probably a little longer as the countries figure out the payout of benefits to descendants of people who didn't get their full deserved payout. So this is a long range by now normalized process in which a very large sum of money has been transferred. So what was the worry about this in Israel? And it was pretty straightforward. The opposition to the Israeli government argued very forcefully that taking money from the Germans would be a betrayal of the memory of the dead. And this was this kind of, by the way, on the picture on top here, it's interesting. It's not very easy to see, but the guy standing on the balcony there with the mustache is Menachem Begin, the famous Israeli prime minister who signed the peace agreement with Egypt about 25 or 27 years later. And the sign that is stretched on the balcony says, "Our honor shall not be sold for money. Our blood shall not be atoned for with merchandise. We will wipe out this shame." And all of that is a reference to the emerging payment agreement with the Germans. A prominent member, the first quote is from a prominent MK, is short for a member of Knesset or member of the Israeli parliament. A prominent member announces, "We are forbidden from any contacts with the murderers. It would be a terrible betrayal of the memory of our martyrs." The editorial of the country's largest newspaper says, "We must inculcate the hearts of our young children with hatred of the Germans." The editor-in-chief of the second largest newspaper, actually in the early 50s, the order might have been reversed, but these are the two largest newspapers at the time and still among the largest in Israel. I mean, imagine this, right? The editor of the New York Times or of USA Today writing something in this spirit today. What will I say to my loved ones, my burned ones, my murdered ones, when they come to me at night and as they continue to come forever? How will I bear my shame when my country is exposed to the nations, a grocery store whose shelves are all empty, and yet here in one corner someone finds a jar of martyrs' ashes and even that is up for sale? So the idea was that, from the opposition, the idea was that Israel was participating in rehabilitating Germany's reputation for a little bit of money. And that was a betrayal of the memory of the dead, that was something that the state didn't have a right to take on. This was the argument from the Israeli right, essentially. Israel at this point is a semi-socialist country ruled by probably what today would be called the Social Democratic ruling party for since its founding. So this was the argument from the right. There was also an argument from the left, from the communist parties that were in 52 completely aligned with Stalin's Russia and admired Stalin, which said that West Germany is a neo-Nazi state, essentially a continuation of the Nazis' capitalism and shouldn't be dealt with on those grounds. So there was opposition right and from the left. The opposition from the right was the more sort of morally credible one, and certainly the more significant one in its political impact. What was the argument of the government and its supporters? And this is in spite of the impression you might get from reading the Segev book. This was still a popular government led by a figure who had sort of legendary status. In the picture there you see David Ben-Gurion, and on the left with the crazy hair, and on the right is Konrad Adenauer, the German chancellor who's elected in 1949, if memory serves. And Adenauer was an anti-Nazi and during the war, and a devout Catholic, and was actually one of the minority in Germany in the very early 1950s who did understand and internalize Germany's moral responsibility for the Holocaust. The picture is later. The picture is from 1960s in a meeting they had in New York. They became friends pretty much, not in small part because of this negotiation process. It's kind of an amazing photo just in its own right. 15 years after, the destruction of the Holocaust, you have the leaders of these two countries in a very intimate kind of conversation. So here's some typical arguments for taking money from the Germans. To persist with the pariah and boycott policy, namely of Germany, is to persist with a nice and moral Don Quixote policy, so what we call a quixotic policy, or a sort of purely moralist policy that doesn't look at reality, but it means jousting with windmills. The reference is to Don Quixote, who jousted with windmills in the novel. It is pretty and consistent, but it brings no benefit, only harm. Do not say that I am trading in blood and that I am haggling over the cruel crimes of which humanity has never seen the like. At the stage of historical decisiveness at which we now stand, namely this is a new fragile country trying to emerge, these monies may be able to aid to a great extent to the building of our land. And that was from the Israeli representative to the Benelux country, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg. And then from Ben-Gurion himself in the Knesset, in the Israeli parliament, what we have to say about the things they did, namely the Germans to us, we'll say if we need to say it, and I doubt we'll feel the need to say it day and night. But better not to say it for a long time, because if you repeat it too often, the world will get sick of you. And in that world, there are Jews too. If a new Jeremiah arises, the reference is to the biblical prophet Jeremiah, who argued mainly on purist moral grounds, he'll speak his piece. So Ben-Gurion's point is essentially, be careful not to be caught up in or be seen as caught up in excessively in the role of victim of the Nazis. There's going to be a limited patience for listening to this narrative in the world, and we need international help, political support, sympathy, in order for establishing the state. So Ben-Gurion very much forward-looking. What was the West German angle about this? Why does Adenauer, why is Adenauer willing to enter into these payments? So for him specifically, the West German Chancellor, taking responsibility is, he did genuinely believe that it was a good thing in itself and merited. And also West Germany was trying to get into NATO. And also it was trying to stay on the good side of the Americans, who were paying for the country's reconstruction as part of the Marshall Program. And Israel in the 1950s garnered a lot of sympathy, and it was good PR as Germans saw it, as at least Adenauer saw it, to take responsibility and take responsibility for the crimes of Holocaust and assist in the building of Israel as a form of atonement. And as he himself admitted, and as other commentators have written, it's a rare moment when morality and self-interest were in convergence, and that is a happy political moment, and Adenauer was sensitive to that. As an aside, it's interesting that this combination that Germany was under of pressure from the outside, international pressure, a very early stage of moral and pragmatic awakening, and having capable leadership, that usually makes things happen historically. That usually heralds historical developments. It's often, it's also quite rare. One thinks of other moments, for example, the transition out of apartheid in South Africa. Of course, there was the bravery and remarkable leadership of Nelson Mandela, but that had to also be matched by some courage on the part of Frederick de Klerk, the last white National Party leader, who was also subject to growing international pressure, who also had somewhat of a moral and pragmatic awakening, such as it was the realization that the white minority could no longer rule the black majority in South Africa, and who was also capable and then too, a historic transformation happened. We can talk about that more in Q&A if you want. This being said, let's not paint an overly rosy picture about this. In the early 1940s, the vast majority of actual Germans, the German population, either completely opposed any payout to Israel, or if it didn't oppose it, didn't think that it had anything to do with them, didn't feel that they had a complicity in it. The controlling narrative was that the Nazis were, like we like to say today, bad apples, that they were an aberration on German history, that they were evil, but the evil was contained in them, and had nothing to say about ordinary Germans. This, of course, the question of the responsibility of ordinary Germans and the whole question of collective responsibility thereafter became a huge, complicated, convoluted philosophical question. Suffice it to say, and we can talk a little bit more about contemporary Germany later if you'd like, but suffice it to say that that narrative changed dramatically, and Germany, probably more than any other country in history, took responsibility for its past in a way that was breathtaking almost, but that would come later. That would come pretty significantly later. In light of this, it's interesting to note that, and I think there was an account of this in the Segev chapters that you read for today, that when Adenauer is shown the draft of the speech of the Israeli Foreign Minister Sharet, which was going to be given in the 1952 Luxembourg conference that had moral language about Germany's responsibility, he told Sharet, he told the Israeli foreign minister something like this. He said, listen, Mr. Minister, I think you're right, but I'm not sure the German people is ready to hear this. And the agreement was that no speeches would be given. So there was this historical ceremony in 52 in Luxembourg where the payoff agreement took shape and formally came into being, but no speeches were given because of essentially Adenauer's political calculation. And Israel was not in a position to veto that. What did the money mean to individuals and the state of Israel? Oops, sorry. So it meant a huge degree of quality of life improvement, including people upgraded their living arrangements, purchased cars and other consumer goods, renovated their homes. Israel in the 1950s is in a period of economic depression and is under economic rationing, and the standard of living was not high. And this changed that for at least some. Israel's famous kibbutzes, the socialist communes, take collective hold of the money that was due to Holocaust survivors who were members of them. And as a result of that, get a infusion of funds to build buildings and facilities. Historically, it's been the case until a few years ago, or until probably more than a few years ago, until 20 years ago, that Israel's kibbutzim had the best swimming pools in the country, and people would either be jealous of them or try to flock to them to frolic in the water. Those were built with German money. Israel's national infrastructure, the power stations, the shipping, the rail system. I have a picture of the German-bought train in the Jerusalem-Tel Aviv line there on the bottom right, was built from German money. The distribution of the monies was unequal, which is an interesting point for us to think about. German descendants of Germany got more money. So people who could establish a connection to Germany got more money than people who hailed from elsewhere. Some of the money was given to the state. A lot of the money was given to actual individuals directly all over the world, and not just to the state. Some of the money was in the form of payments. Some of the money was in the form of compensation. I I do have to say, on a personal note, I come from a family of Holocaust survivors. All of my four grandparents survived the Holocaust. Three of them survived Auschwitz, and one, my mom's dad, was in a labor camp outside of Budapest. And my family received these funds to a very significant degree. And not only that, but two of my grandparents were able to establish that they were part of what Greg might know what this is called in German. I tried to look it up, but there was it's like a typically German phrase, something like the German culture circle or something like that, Deutsche Kultur something. And once they were able to establish this, so my grandfather had been a doctor when Transylvania, which is where he's from, was still part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and was able to establish it that way. My grandmother, something similar. They got a German pension as well. And the reason I say this is that, and I double checked this with my parents last night because I really wanted to be accurate about this kind of stuff. It transformed their socioeconomic situation. It really did. And, I'm the product of Israeli private schools and private universities, and that costs money as it does here. And part of how that was possible to do is with German money. So, and the fact that some people got it meant that some people didn't get it. So, for example, much of the Jews from the Middle Eastern origin who hadn't been impacted by the Holocaust, although even there, for example, Moroccan Jews, even though they weren't murdered, were impacted by the Holocaust. They didn't get the infusion of cash, and so one interesting consequence of all of this is that it actually increased, deepened socioeconomic inequalities and divides in Israel, and is the source of some of the lasting inequalities in Israel. There might be an interesting parallel here. There might be an interesting parallel for thinking about unintended or unforeseen consequences here. As people are beginning to talk about the details of an American reparation projects for slavery, eligibility is going to be a question. And in some of the discussions of this, it's being proposed that African Americans are going to have to establish one way or another that they hail from, to one extent or another, slaves brought to the American colonies, as opposed to people who immigrated from Caribbean nations later on, even though Caribbean nations had slavery as well. They just didn't have American slavery. And so if something like that is going to be the case, it's interesting to consider the kind of, this is a stage 2 type of question, but it's interesting to consider the kind of unintended social consequences that created, for example, in the Israeli-German context. Will this create the kind of tension between different parts of the African-American diaspora that it did create between different parts of the Jewish diaspora in Israel? By the way, fun fact, that's a Mercedes-Benz taxi down there on the left. If you visited Israel until 10 years ago or 15 years ago, you wouldn't see a ton of fancy cars, but all of the taxis were Mercedeses. And that was part of the German payout program, which was paid out in goods. So you had this country in which there were many, many Holocaust survivors, and they were traveling in German-made taxis, while others of their compatriots were boycotting German cars because of the Holocaust. So it's an interesting little sort of picture from the ground, if you will. Let's move a little bit more to the philosophical. What's the symbolic weight of paying out money? And the argument is something like this. A survivor who gets a payout says something like this: what happened to me, the fact that I was persecuted in this way, is important enough to merit compensation. Now, money is a key form of acknowledgement, especially in open, free, capitalist, choose your more benign or less benign descriptor societies. So money matters, right? Money is a key indicator of value and the social systems and worth and the social systems that we have. Maybe it shouldn't be, but it is. So getting money in itself for what happened to you is a form of acknowledgement that what happened to you is real. And insofar as these mass atrocity crimes are characterized by invisibility of the people who the crimes are perpetrated against, they don't count. Getting money makes you count again, right? There's a parallel kind of argument that's always been made about war crime trials. Part of why war crime trials are restorative for the victims is because they feel that now that these trials are happening to the people who hurt them, impunity has ended. They feel that now, for the first time, they merit the criminal law's protection. You guys walk around the street, and if somebody assaults you, the law gets involved. And that's part of what it means to be a citizen with dignity in a democratic republic, namely that what happens to you merits the criminal law's protection. And if you were a Jew, obviously in post-Hitler Germany, pretty quickly you didn't get the criminal law's protection. In fact, part of what the Nuremberg laws wanted to declare is that Jews do not merit the criminal law's protection. So there's a similar kind of resurfacing or revisibility argument going on with getting compensation. What happened to you is important enough to merit monetary compensation. So that's one important symbolic aspect of getting payment. Another one is this. It's interesting. If there's an agency that gets the money to pay that out to the people, that agency comes to speak for the people. So who gets the money is also not only a technical question, but a symbolic question. Israel really wanted to get most of the money, so that it became, by getting most of the money and handing it out to its citizens, distributing it, so that it became the symbolic representative of Jews, right? If there's going to be some organization that gets the monetary part of African-American reparations by getting the funds and being responsible for their distribution, that organization accrues a symbolic weight, a symbolic value. In the Israeli-German case, that didn't quite happen. Most of the money went to individuals, and the state's ambition in this case was frustrated. It would have been helpful for it in the 1950s to make its argument that it represents Jews rather than just a simple nation state in which there are many Jews. Another interesting symbolic question is who pays and who doesn't pay, right? Does the German state pay, which happened to be the case? Do German corporations like Volkswagen or Mercedes pay? There was an interesting story going to the American context of reparations in Georgetown University, where the Jesuits were challenged to pay reparations for slaves that they had sold early on in the existence of what was then Georgetown College. And this started, interestingly, as a student movement in Georgetown that was collected from their student fees. And the fact that student paid said something about the university and pressured the university to change its policies. So when we come to African-American reparations, who is going to pay them out, right, is a question of symbolic importance. Compensation can also symbolically signal an end to claims or finality, and that's part of why it's controversial among victims, and part of why it's wanted by the payer. The payer thinks, they will have no more claims from me after this, and this will be the beginning of normalization. The payees are often more skeptical of that. And interestingly, as a piece of evidence about the symbolic weight of paying, when people don't want to pay, when the Germans didn't want to pay reparations of Israel, it wasn't because it was going to bankrupt them, because it didn't, and it wasn't a lot of money. By some calculations, it turned out to be between $15 and $25 per year per German over the years, but it was because of the symbolic meaning. And if people didn't want to accept the money, it wasn't because it wasn't enough. Again, so just the other side of that argument. That being said, there's this huge gap between the symbolic level and the administration of any reparations or payout agreement. Once the transactional aspects of paying take the fore, it becomes a straight up business negotiation where each side is going to try to maximize their benefit, regardless of the fact that this is about big questions of historical justice. So the Germans tried to screw Israel as much as they can. Can't put that in much, at least for a while, in much more benign language. They argued that people weren't eligible because they didn't come from the appropriate places. They said you can be made whole by a smaller sum of money, and so on and so forth. Similar kind of really haggling took place in New Zealand as the Crown was beginning to compensate Maori tribes. Even though there was acknowledgement of responsibility, they said, well, we're going to pay your tribe $10 million rather than $30 million. And there was a whole sort of bizarre aspect to it. Another question in the distribution is the funds that the Israeli government did get, it didn't always want to give out as was agreed, not necessarily because of corruption at the time, but more because of a reassessment of its priorities. So there was a contractual obligation to give money to certain kinds of people, and it wasn't given out. One interesting example is Israel got money to give elderly Holocaust survivors assistance and co-payments for medication. And later that they just didn't get it. So there's this big gap between, I have the little T.S. Eliot quote there for you there on the bottom, between the idea and the act, between the idea and the reality. And you might wonder if something similar won't happen. It probably will happen, because it always happens, if there are ever reparations for African Americans for slavery. There will be ugly arguments about proving eligibility, right? What's the right kind of evidence? Does the family Bible count? Do you have to produce documents? Do you have to, is DNA genealogical testing going to be involved? And so on and so forth. And how much money should be paid out and for how long? So it's interesting to consider this move from the idea of compensation to the administration of compensation. It's an unglorious move, to say the least. Let me put this for you as we come closer to the end of my presentation. I want to make sure that we have enough time for discussion. Let me put this to you in the context of transitional justice. Transitional justice is an umbrella term describing how countries come to terms with their past, the ways in which they come to terms with their past. Money, which we've been talking about, monetary compensation, is one small part of that. Another part of it is the transfer or return of resources, so stolen land or stolen real estate or stolen artifacts, apologies and acknowledgement of wrongdoing, so symbolic acts are another part of that. Famously in 1972, if I'm remembering correctly, the German Chancellor, the West German Chancellor Willy Brandt went to Warsaw to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising monument. So this is 20 years after the signing of this agreement. And he falls to his knees in front of the monument to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And that's a famous symbolic act of acknowledgement of wrongdoing. fact-finding about the truth, about the past, so truth commissions or historical commissions like they had in South Africa that were aimed to provide historical evidence of what had gone on during the time of mass killing. Punishment like the Nuremberg trials or like the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia or Rwanda. Lustration policies, which are essentially administrative purges. The Germans had one example of that in denazification. We did a similar thing and failed spectacularly in Iraq with de-Baathification. Reparations as a term of art is usually meant to include money, transfer of stolen resources, and acknowledgement. And so you'll see that reparations is a larger term than just money payouts. The Israeli-German case that we've been discussing involves primarily the monetary compensation, which is a small, very small part of transitional justice. Germany, ultimately Germans or Nazis were subjected to many other forms of transitional justice as well. There were trials in both Germany and Israel, famously probably the Nuremberg trials and the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem. Germany did express regret on various occasions and otherwise assumed responsibility. It did create monuments, but these things didn't happen in the same time, which is actually interesting and I think the subject of our next slide. So one question to ask is whether it matters if transitional justice measures, or as many of them as possible, happen around the same time. In the German case, trials, compensation, lustration, namely purges, acknowledgement, memorialization, came at different time. They're still happening, but there wasn't like a period in some way like there was in South Africa, or more strikingly, when you talk about New Zealand's compensation to Maoris, there you had at the same time a money compensation program, the giving back of land in some cases, and a public apology happening in very quick succession. Does the concentration of these measures matter politically? Does it matter morally? Does it matter historically? And here's where this probably connects directly, for example, to the Coates article, the famous Nir Eisikovits article on the reparations that you read. Does the passage of time weaken some of our claims? In some legal contexts, a very humdrum legal context, it does. For example, easement. If somebody uses your property over years to cut a shortcut to get to the train, at some point, the fact of using it for a long time weakens the claim of ownership. That is called an easement in the law. Does the passage of time matter for the duty to acknowledge, for the duty to compensate, for the duty to return lands and artifacts? And you have to remember, with the passage of time, also new claims. For example, if land was stolen and then people who were born much after the theft are living in it, you can only fix the old problem at the expense of creating a new one, right? It's interesting that Coates spends so much time in the article talking about Chicago housing policy, right? Why is that the case? And in part, and he says as much as he said as much in interviews afterwards. In part because the Chicago housing policy hurt people who are still living now and suffered from that policy, and as a result, it kind of brackets the passage of time worry. But if you go too far down that direction, you weaken your claim for moral and other reparations for slavery itself. So that's an interesting dilemma broadly in transitional justice and certainly in the American context. I think I want to end with this slide. I don't only think I want to end with this slide, I don't have any other slides. And this one I think is also very relevant for our American case here. What's the role of religion and the way that religious values permeate culture in transitional justice? You guys, I think, read Dworkin and Law's Empire. And the Herculean judge, Dworkin's Herculean judge, is one who is capable of reading the history of the specific polity in a way that kind of puts it in the best light, puts it in a coherent light, incorporates the values of the community, and so on and so forth. Did you talk about that kind of stuff, Greg?
We ended up just reading Justice for Hedgehogs because it was too much.
Okay.
But you can make a point, certainly.
Yeah. So, you know, straightforwardly, religion often influences our choice of transitional instruments. So part of why South Africa chose a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that gave up on punishment was shaped by political necessity. In part, it was a straight up political compromise between the ANC and the National Party. A political compromise born of the fact that the whites were no longer strong enough to rule a black majority, and the ANC was probably not strong enough to impose the kind of Nuremberg-style justice that it wanted to impose on whites in South Africa. So they came up with an arrangement. But part of why the arrangement worked, the TRC arrangement, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, which gave up on punishment in return for full disclosure from perpetrators on both sides, is because there's a deeply held Christian view about the necessity of forgiveness in politics that combines coherently with an African conceptual commitment to this idea of Ubuntu, that people become people through other people, right? That we can't be whole if the community is broken. There's Tutu's memoir, Desmond Tutu, the Archbishop Desmond Tutu headed up the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and his memoir was called No Future Without Forgiveness, and essentially makes that argument. There's a picture there underneath that of a Truth and Reconciliation hearing. And again, you have the kind of Christian religious language. Reconciliation is a loaded term, obviously, in Christianity. In Judaism, on the other hand, forgiveness doesn't have that kind of magisterial status that it has in Christianity. And the language of retribution that you heard in those early quotes from the newspapers, it doesn't raise the kind of conflict that it would in a society with a profoundly Christian ethos. But important to note, the arguments in Israel were completely grounded in religion as well, or at least paid lip service if they weren't completely grounded or made reference to them. You would see that the twin biblical imperatives were invoked. The right invoked to remember what Amalek did to you, Amalek being the nation that, as the Jews in Jewish lore were exiting Egypt, Amalek had attacked the fleeing Jews and had tried to kill them and rob them. And there's this sort of divine commandment, famous divine commandment, if I'm remembering correctly, in Exodus, to never forget what the Amalekites had done to you, which comes up in various parts of liturgy. And the Germans were analogized to Amalekites in the Israeli right in the early 1950s. And when Ben-Gurion made his pragmatic argument, namely that we need the money for the state, it wasn't only a pragmatic argument. It also made reference to the famous principle that you can't both murder and inherit, which makes reference to a story in the Book of Kings where I believe a king took a poor person's winery or asset after they murdered him. So would we allow the Germans to both murder us and not pay the price and continue to accrue our wealth, as it were? Ben-Gurion asked, and in asking made a reference to a deeply seated cultural and moral and religious principle. And the reason I bring this up is how will religion play out in the American reparations context? All of this language is religiously loaded, for better and for worse, coming to terms with the past, the idea of closing the books, atonement, redemption, healing, forgiveness. This is not neutral language that can trip us up or bolster transitional processes. Sometimes it trips up transitional processes where you try to export your religious ideas on another country's transitional process. And sometimes when you choose the right one, it can make a big difference, as I would argue that it did with all of the imperfections in South Africa. So let me stop here, and I am very happy to continue the discussion.